session in the program. But the first one that we really, so we'll have 3 different speakers here, and they really all look at how, licensing and how it can be, to a certain degree, and a barrier to access, but also how it can be, you can see this barrier as an opportunity and use it to create golden solutions, you know, sort of seeing an opportunity where others see a problem. That's the tenor of this whole session. So to start off with, we're going to have Margaret Allen, who is the State Librarian of Western Australia and a member of our board, and also the Chair of the Australian Libraries Copyright Committee. Do you want more of a bio? No. Yeah, I didn't think she did. Margaret is going to run you through what has been going on in the last few years with Standards Australia, because we know a lot of people know a little bit about this and know that there is a bit of an issue about access and licensing, but they don't know the full details. So Margaret's been right in the fray from the start, so she can tell us all.
Okay. Thanks, Jess. And yes, I'm not sure that there's been a big opportunity out of this yet. I haven't quite seen it. So anyway, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the National Library sits, and we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So developments with Australian standards. Well, Jess asked me to talk about this. She said, you've got 20 minutes. I said to her, well, that'll take about 5 seconds, because actually there's been no recent developments, but there actually has been some movement in the last couple of days, which I'll touch on. But instead I thought a bit of a potted history around this, what I think is a somewhat sorry saga. And you'll see where a right and a necessity comes in due course. Okay, let's... Oops. Hang on. I'm just... Sorry. There we go. I'll go old school. So it's a somewhat familiar story. So we have a monopoly supplier who garners significant profit from the work of others. A product licence offering which is really at odds with the core role of libraries in providing access to information. We have licence agreements that override exceptions in the Copyright Act, which further erode the ability of libraries to meet their core role. We have government reports on the table that make some somewhat sensible suggestions, but they lay dormant. And we have ongoing advocacy by the sector, which is ongoing, but somewhat slow or makes very little progress. So I think it's a story that many of us, particularly who work in the library sector, would be very familiar with. But critically here, we're talking about access to the laws of Australia. So it's, I think, a somewhat different case. So I'll cover a bit of a potted history. It will be mainly from the perspective of National and State Libraries Australia, but I acknowledge that there has been advocacy and ongoing work by colleagues in the university sector and the COAG education group. So there's about 2,000 Australian standards that are referenced into Australian laws, regulations and bylaws, and that gives them a quasi-legal status. So this is at federal, state and local government level. Actually, the real number involved can't even be agreed by all the parties. But I think regardless, when you're talking about 2,000 individual standards, you'd agree that it's a very large corpus of material. And standards are used in all sorts of areas referenced in Australian law. So think public interest areas like public health, environmental and other safety standards, fire safety standards. There's all sorts of other things, public interest topics, you know, COTS, motorbike helmets. There's a whole range of Australian standards that are referenced in laws and therefore become law. Now, as with other Australian laws, these standards ought to be readily and easily available free of charge, but they're not. And a fundamental democratic principle is that citizens should have the right to access the laws that affect them. And transparency and regulatory transparency really also relies on easy access to the law. Even parliamentarians can't readily get access to it. There are exceptions for parliamentary librarians, but not for parliamentarians. Unlike the UK and I think New Zealand, there's actually specific exceptions that enable parliamentarians to get access to the content they need. And this is really important because it's about scrutinising the laws of the land as they move through Parliament. Now, Standards Australia is a peak non-government, non-profit organisation responsible for the development of standards. And they coordinate and publish the work of a range of subject matter experts to develop these standards. Now, these subject matter experts come from right across business, government and academia, and their time is almost always funded by their employer, as is the expenses and the travel expenses and the other expenses to attend the meeting. So the intellectual effort is pretty well all volunteer or funded, at least funded by other people. And this was specifically recognised in an inquiry that I'm going to talk about shortly. But you can see that the inquiry summarised it by saying, whilst the cost of creating and publishing the standard and overseeing the process is borne by Standards Australia, it's entirely dependent on the voluntary effort of others. So volunteers are creating the standards, which are then become law, but community can't get to that part of the law. Now, Standards Australia have a formal MOU with the Australian Government, and that MOU, which includes funding, includes recognition that they represent Australia at international forum around standards. So they're actually recognised and given licence, if you like, by the government to act on our behalf in terms of standards. And that adds to their status as being a peak body. Now, there is a sort of a long history to this, but in 2003, Standards Australia spun off what was then their publishing arm and became SAI Global. SAI Global was subsequently acquired by a private equity firm, and I think we can work out what's happened from there. But this was because of a perception of a conflict of interest between their role in developing standards, publishing, marketing and selling them, and also being the assessor. And if you remember back to the quality movement, what was it, whichever it was, 9001, and everyone was accredited, they were doing all of those functions. So it was a perceived conflict of interest, which is why the publication and marketing of the standards was spun off. So, libraries and access to Australian standards. They are relatively high cost when we compare them with our other digital resources. They are offered on very restrictive access terms. Usually, in the past, has been a single terminal within the building, printing limited to one page, no interlibrary loan. We're talking about the digital here. And we were subject to annual subscription fees of CPI plus 2%, and that's because of the agreement between Standards Australia and SAI Global. So well above CPI in terms of the costs that we were incurring. And in 2016, NASLA walked away from the agreement because it was just too difficult. So, and this was after a very long-standing, difficult relationship and us trying to renegotiate it. So that's a bit of a sorry tale too. So in 2015, Western Australian Parliament got a bit concerned about this, and I'm sorry for all of the text in here. But the Joint Standing Committee on Delegated Legislation actually became concerned about its inability to scrutinise legislation because they couldn't get access to the standards that they needed to undertake that role. And that is the role of that committee, is to scrutinise legislation, regulation and other legislative matters. So They couldn't get copies easily in the Parliament without paying for them. Their staff couldn't get to them without paying high costs. So, in a sense, it was getting in the way of the democratic process. So there was an inquiry. And there's a very good and detailed report which has covered everything from the financial relationship between Standards Australia and SAI Global, lots of submissions from the library sector, from NASLA, from ALIA, from CALL, from Public Libraries WA, from the State Library of Western Australia, and as well unions and businesses were making the case around how difficult it was to access standards. So something that started in a way as an issue around scrutiny in Parliament actually turned into, I think, much more of a public interest question. Interestingly, the Commonwealth, in their response to questions from the committee, assumed, and in fact the letter from the then minister, actually said that, well, you can get what's the problem? I'm paraphrasing, yes. But you can get access to standards in Australian libraries. Didn't even know that, in fact, that was not possible. So the public policy position on ensuring that the laws of Australia were freely available relied on public libraries. So the committee decided that there was clearly a problem. And you can see just the first paragraph. This was effectively saying that, effectively in the state of Western Australia, this was a Western Australian inquiry, but the only place that you could see a lot of the law was in an office in metropolitan Perth between 9 and 4 p.m. Monday to Friday, which was a very unsatisfactory position in a democratic society. So they recognised that there was a problem. Now, the committee didn't ignore the question that funds are needed to produce standards, that you have to have income, it has to find a way to be self-sustaining. But interestingly, they found that the money spent from Western Australia alone, so this is not across the nation, which was estimated at some $5.5 million in revenue from Western Australia to Standards Australia, of which $1 million came from the public purse. But that $5.5 million was actually almost the same as that derived by Standards Australia from their publishing agreement with SAI Global. So in extrapolating that right across the nation, they came to the conclusion that in fact the spend from the public purse would actually be enough to fund the whole standards production process and to make them freely available. So the conclusion is that there is enough money in the system, it's just going to different places. At that stage it was, a lot of it was going through SAI Global to a private equity firm, and the rest to Standards Australia. But meanwhile, the Australian government was funding this but not having access. So definitely an issue. So the matter was raised by Western Australia to the COAG Industry and Skills Minister. So there was a working group was formed to look at the issue through 2017. Now, interestingly, there were 4 NASLA CEOs on that working group, often representing their state, plus NASLA itself. Standards Australia argued strongly and consistently that the change to a non-exclusive licence agreement after 2018, when their agreement with SAI Global ceased, would solve the problem, because we would have market competition. That would force the price down, it would create other licensing options, and everything would be fine. Thank you very much. So overall, that COAG work resulted in no change to the community access outcomes. So during this time, interestingly, SAI Global approached NASLA about recommencing negotiations, and access was briefly restored. That was until mid-2018 when the new wiring standard was released, and suddenly we didn't have access anymore, and we've not had access since. So SAI Global then last year went through a consultation process on what their future should look like in terms of its publishing model. And there was a submission from the ALCC, NASLA and ALIA. It was a joint submission, and you can see it on the ALCC's website. And we argued that there was a strong mandate for Standards Australia to ensure public access. It's laws of the country, there's a significant government funding into this equation to produce these laws. And that profit shouldn't be the driver, given the regulatory and public good outcomes of standards. And access should be a core principle, and we recommended non-exclusive distribution model, preferably using Creative Commons licensing, and that libraries and archives were obvious partners to help to make this happen. So Standards Australia's response when they released the outcome late in 2019. They've thought of libraries, and that's a great thing, but they're focusing on reading room access, so access just in our reading rooms, no broad digital delivery across the community, but it's in physical public libraries, and it's only for personal, domestic and household use, so that private use function. They've committed to funding access to its content for personal, domestic and household use, but that won't come until 2023, so we still have 3 years to wait. And in areas of high public interest and benefit, they want partners to create plain English guides, because apparently the law is complex and they need that. But again, they're looking for volunteer labour to do this. So I don't know what you think, but frankly, I don't think it's addressed any of the concerns that the sector has. It's a fairly half-hearted response to what I think is a pretty important matter. So where are we now? So we are still waiting for a reasonable licensing offer with useful access terms. It looks like it might be 2023 before we're there with that. NASLA has met multiple times with the Standards Australia executive and their new publishers. The last offer we had was pretty well double the price we were paying under SAI Global, so much for market competition, driving the price down. And the access terms were even more restrictive. So that argument that we're going to solve this by market competition, it hasn't eventuated. NASLA put a counter-offer in mid-December, and there was no response until late last week. So we have an offer. Price-wise, it's much better, but at the moment, the conditions are such that I think we need to think very carefully about whether we would accept that. It currently undermines some of the principles of anonymity in terms of our users and their use in the reading room, because it's saying that, we have to have registered users. There's certainly no broad online access, so it's really not particularly helpful. I, of course, come from looking at the situation in Western Australia. How do I deliver information on standards to someone in Kununurra when it's a, $1,200 return flight to come down to Perth to consult a standard? I can't interlibrary loan it. I can't print a portion of it because the licence is saying that I can't. So I'm not sure how far we've got. NASLA will continue to negotiate and try and get there, but we've probably got a decision coming up around whether we continue to make a stand or whether we try and accept the offer and try and negotiate from there. So, back to my opening remarks, there really hasn't been any positive developments, I don't think, in terms of access to Australian standards, and particularly those that form part of Australian law. So, thank you.
People will have for Margaret specifically now, rather than doing a panel at the end like we have with the other sessions. Anybody have a specific question for Margaret? Derek does.
Margaret, who could fix this problem?
Sorry?
Who could fix this problem?
Well, it's a political will and a public policy issue. So New Zealand have actually taken their standards development back in to government, so they wound up their equivalent. I'm not sure. Reports are mixed. I'm not entirely sure that it's rosy. But I think the principle that they are a public good and therefore governments, and they are law, partly law, therefore government will fund it. There still is a cost recovery model, and I don't think any of us would be concerned about that. But I think it's political. COAG didn't really fix it. They've relied on the assurances of Standards Australia that all would be fine with competition. We know from our experience that doesn't necessarily resolve issues. No, it sits in the industry and science, and I'm not exactly sure of the current name of the department, but that's where it sits.
I should point out, of course, Standards Australia could fix it as well, just by having better licensing terms. The libraries don't actually object to paying for them. It's the fact that they are so restrictive on top of the high licence fees.
The high
that's
cost.
the real concern.
There's one.
Thanks, Jess. I just wanted to add that as part of the last round of submissions and that to Standards Australia, Austlii offered that if ever the licensing problem is solved, Austlii will be a free access distributor at no cost to anyone else.
Yep. So there are ways in which it can be done.
I was also going to say, not so much a question but a comment, that it's worth noting too that the Standards Australia distribution framework has no transparency around the consultation that occurred. It doesn't even mention how many submissions were made, let alone any kind of overview of what those submissions said or any of the competing ideas or propositions. They just literally go, we did a consultation, this is the framework.
Correct. Okay.
We follow on that very sad story about licensing being used to restrict access to Australia's laws, with a very sad story about licensing being used to restrict access to Australian and international culture. But it is a good story for us because it's a very exciting new developments in the area and new information with the launch of the results of... I can't see Rebecca. Where is she? I'm here. Ah, there you go. You're right there. The launch of the results of the survey, the National Library Survey of the e-lending project that Associate Professor Rebecca Giblin and has been leading with a large number of other people in the last few years. Those who've been to recent forums will know that we...
You don't need to introduce me.
No.
Let me just start.
All I was going to say is that we have been having updates on this almost every year, so it's kind of exciting to have another one and a launch.
Yeah.
There you go.
I feel you all know me and everyone has to get to flights, and I'm super excited to talk about this, so let's just jump right into it. So thanks so much to the ADA again for inviting me back to keep talking about this, which is a project that I love. It's so interesting. And now we are launching our report of our nationwide library survey on e-lending. So most of you here are familiar with this project. It's a linkage bringing together terrific library partners from within Australia and also all around the world with this very good-looking team of researchers across law and data science and social research. And we have been working together for a few years now to gather all kinds of new data about how library e-lending is actually working in practice. We've previously conducted a whole bunch of studies. There's the Focused Australian study, which compares availability of ebooks for lending across 5 local aggregators here, an international equivalent that looks at the availability of those same books across 5 different countries, but from a single aggregator. Our large-scale international study where we looked at almost 100,000 books to compare how they were being priced and licensed in different countries and patterns about who controlled those books. and a bestseller study in which we measured how long it took for ebooks at a particular point in time to become available for e-lending in libraries. And in progress as well, we have a publisher study where we are interviewing publishers to understand their perspectives on how everything works and how and why they make the decisions that they do about e-lending, which I'm going to mention again right at the very end. And of course, we have all of our data from the completed studies available on our website. I hope you've been there. I hope you have played with our very cool interactive dashboards. And if you haven't, you should do that, but not until I finish talking. So do definitely check that out. So we started this project because we had really serious concerns about the availability and accessibility of books for e-lending, digital lending within libraries. And now, of course, we regulate ebooks really differently to the way we regulate physical books. Libraries have always been able to buy and lend physical books without needing anybody's permission, but with ebooks it's different. Buying and lending ebooks involves the making of copies and transmissions, and that means we do need the publisher's permission. And publishers have been exercising those new rights over ebooks in a whole bunch of different ways. And what we wanted to understand is exactly how that was playing out and how that impacts public libraries' abilities to fulfill their public interest missions. Now, over time, it's 4 years, I think, or maybe even 5 years since this was an apple in our eye. At that time, we were concerned, but what's happened is in the last year or two, we've seen some really troubling developments that makes this more important than ever. So we see that 4 of the big 5 publishers have shifted to what we call exploding licenses. Those are time-limited licenses. So the library will have access to a title. They can lend it out to one person at a time for usually 36 times or 2 years, whichever comes first. And once that clock stops ticking and the time runs out, the book is deleted from their collections, even if nobody ever borrowed it at all. Now, the ones shifting to exploding licenses include Hachette, but that at least doesn't bother us. It doesn't make us any worse off because Hachette still refuses to license any books to libraries in Australia or any other Commonwealth country on any terms whatsoever. And that's the world's 3rd largest trade and educational publisher. But we also see Macmillan has reintroduced embargoes on books. The bestseller study we did showed that publishers were very willing to make their new books available to libraries, appreciating the discoverability that they provided and perhaps understanding the equity issues about making that kind of content available to people that might not be able to purchase it in the marketplace. But embargoes have come back thanks to Overdrive, and they've made that decision quoting data that they have not made available, and which Overdrive, who's the leading aggregator in the world, the Overdrive CEO says that data simply can't be right because it doesn't match anything that they've got on their end. And we're also seeing Amazon whispering into publishers' ears about e-lending being bad for them and their authors. Now, Amazon obviously has an interest in being the only supplier of books. In the Amazon dystopia, there are no public libraries. We just have the Kindle Unlimited subscription service that everybody pays for, and if you're a poor person, you get some vouchers for some free books. So why do we need libraries anymore? That's really what they're aiming for and the world they would like to see. So they're perhaps not a friend to any of us here. But we keep hearing that these whispers are being taken to heart by publishers and they're really concerning them. And we're going to come back again at the end to why that might be. So again, there's no public data to support Amazon's claims. And indeed, they're contradicting the evidence that has been publicly made available about the relationship between library access to books and book sales. And so all of this makes open and transparent and rigorous data and evidence more timely and important than ever. So I'm delighted to be here to be able to launch our report. It's a world first report from a nationwide survey that we ran just over a year ago. And the reason it took us that amount of time to process this data is because we got extraordinarily generous and thoughtful responses that really humbled us from the library communities. So many committed librarians took time out of their busy, very busy work schedules. We could see in the responses how long the library spent filling out this survey, and it was just really generous. So we've had a lot of really rich data to work with. And I want to say all of our research is conducted independently, and sometimes our findings go against common beliefs in the library sector about how things are working, or maybe not everybody likes the findings that we receive. But I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge our wonderful partners and the wonderful library communities that have just shown such an open-mindedness in listening to the evidence, looking at it, evaluating it for themselves to see what they think it's worth, and very often changing their minds. And you don't always get that, so thank you so much. All right, now let me jump into the results. What we wanted to understand with this survey was how publisher licensing practices were impacting library decisions about which books to add to their collections. And we also wanted to understand the trade-offs that libraries were making in balancing their scarce resources and their community's diverse needs in the e-lending space. So, we were really happy with the response rate. There are a number of state or territory-wide consortia, as you see. We heard from all of those: Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, the ACT, and the Northern Territory. And then some libraries in those regions also top up the collection separately, and we heard from 18 of those individual libraries as well. We heard from, then of course there's lots of states where the libraries are divided up into public council areas or smaller consortia. We heard from 48% of Queensland libraries, 51% of New South Wales libraries, and 83% of Victorian libraries, so yay for my home state, thank you so much. But Ross tells me 50% is about right for a response rate from New South Wales, so I won't feel too hurt about that. But overall, you can see this is a really terrific response rate. And I just want to mention, just when you're thinking, when I'm talking about the numerical results here, obviously, these responses represent really different geographical areas and really different numbers of readers. It was impossible to normalise for that in this format. And so when I talk about what percentage of libraries said what, I want you to just bear in mind that sometimes we were talking about a library that represents an enormous place, and sometimes we might be talking about a little regional library, and think less about those numbers and more about the trends and what we're getting from that. So we began by asking libraries which platforms they use for e-lending, how many they use, and about 2/3 used more than one. The median was 2, and there were 3 libraries that were managing 4 separate platforms. And so you won't be surprised to know that platform fees, which can easily run to tens of thousands of dollars a year per platform, were one of the really big concerns that libraries made. So if we've got these platform fees, why is it that libraries contract with more than one aggregator? It's because libraries see public demand for books as the most important factor in deciding whether to purchase titles. And that came out really consistently through responses to a whole bunch of the questions that we asked. So here's one example. We asked libraries to rank each of these factors in order of importance. So known demand, anticipated demand. Known demand might be customer requests and holds for books. Anticipated demand, pre-release buzz, or maybe it's a well-known author, or it's part of a series that's gone very well before. We've got curation factors as well, whether the library sees it as important to hold the book independent of demand for it, the price, and the license type. And what we saw is that known and anticipated demand were by far the most highly ranked factors over all of those other considerations. We saw the importance of demand again when we asked libraries whether they would purchase titles with high demand regardless of unattractive pricing. And 38% just gave a flat yes. A further 47% said it depends, but then gave us further explanation to suggest that they often felt that they didn't really have a choice. If their readers wanted that book and that book was available, then libraries felt that it was part of their mission to do everything that they could to deliver access to that book. And just 14% said a flat no. And there was a real sense of frustration in the responses to these questions. And one of the respondents told us, remaining relevant means that we're a slave to demand-driven purchasing. Don't tell the publisher. I hope that was rhetorical because we've put this on the front page of the report and I think they're going to find out. But the thing is, it's really important for us all to understand this environment that we're working in. Libraries also told us that licensing and pricing models are negatively impacting the breadth and the depth of their collections. And one library told us, for example, some titles just move at a slower pace than the current models would allow. So things like Australian poetry. And when publishers make that kind of title available only on those time-limited exploding licenses, libraries are weighing up whether they do think that they'll circulate enough to justify the cost. And they're often concluding that even if they think it's important to hold that book in their collection because it's by an Australian author, that it's culturally important, they're often concluding that they just can't add it, that their very precious collection dollars need to be allocated somewhere less risky. And that's not at all because libraries see their role as just providing access to the newest and shiniest bestsellers, right? That's not it at all, right? Elsewhere in their answers, they emphasize to us just how important they see their curation role to be. They want to hold Australian books and older literary prize winners, older books in their collections ongoing. Right? And they told us it was more important to them to hold older Australian bestsellers than new international bestsellers. That's how important they see the curation role to be. But again, those exploding licenses often make it infeasible for them to actually fulfill that mission. So we asked what kinds of books libraries would be more or less likely to buy on those exploding licenses. And they told us they're more likely to support known Australian authors than known international authors. They're more likely to support, the known Australians. They're less likely to buy books by debut authors, books by writers published outside of the Big Five, and older titles. So again, you can see these are the ones that are likely to have less demand, and so they're the ones that libraries feel are too risky to add to their collections as often as they would like to when they're made available on those terms. So that kind of term, at least in some cases, seems to actually be working against books by some publishers and some authors, and results in the collection being tilted to other kinds of books. We also asked libraries for their wish lists, and they strongly communicated their desire for multiple license types and price points. One told us that uniform licensing models, where you just have a take it or leave it one option, one price, can lead to a shallow collection that favours stuff that only moves in the short term rather than the long term, and may not have been borrowed in the license period. So again, you're seeing here the concern about those exploding licenses that can expire before the libraries have really had or library patrons have really had a chance to read those books. Now, that desire for multiple license types and options is really too bad, because as our previous research has demonstrated, e-lending licensing is based on a one-size-fits-all model. Libraries are only very rarely offered a choice of license. Our respondents told us as well that they were really interested in trying out per loan licenses and simultaneous use licenses. And these were the biggest things in the wish list. These models are finally starting to become a little bit more common. Some publishers are dipping a toe in to try them out, but they are still relatively rare in the Australian market. But libraries told us if they could have access to per loan licenses, they would hold more of those risky titles, the ones with uncertain demand, those less popular works, those classic titles. They told us it would reduce the penalty of poor purchase decisions. They were interested in making sure that the money that they spent on the collection went as closely as they could to the books and the publishers and the authors of the books that were actually circulating, right? Rather than something that just sort of sat there, was never touched, and was deleted after 2 years. And they also said it would help serve smaller populations. So, for example, in rural libraries. Another thing we asked about was about e-collections in languages other than English. Because, of course, one of the wonderful things about ebooks is that they do have that potential to reach disenfranchised populations, including those that aren't from the dominant language. But libraries reported they have relatively few books to serve non-English speaking populations. So we see that 68% of the respondents said they had none at all, and 25% said just a little. And the most we got was that 7% of libraries admitted to having a moderate amount, but nobody claimed more than that. And also really interesting was our finding that very few libraries were actively working to address that. And what they told us about was this negative loop that they'd ended up in. And the way it works is this. It's really difficult to get access to quality books in a range of other languages. So they didn't buy many. That meant they were pretty unattractive to LOTE borrowers, right? This is a really shallow collection, nothing much to see there. So there was no one around to actually borrow those books. Because of that, the LOTE titles didn't circulate. And so libraries didn't add to those collections or repurchase the titles once the license expired if they were the exploding licenses. And the end result of this unhappy loop is that it suggests there's no demand, and so there's no real investment being put into making more foreign language books available. So there we are on that. The final finding I want to mention concerns the digital divide. And even today, probably none of you will be surprised to hear that libraries report real challenges serving rural and remote communities and vulnerable populations. Not everybody has a suitable, we were hearing before, 6 internet-supported devices, internet-enabled devices, mum, the CIO who's making sure everything's charged. Not everyone has any of that. Not everyone has an internet connection. We hear there's still 14% of Australians without broadband. And indeed, in some parts of this vast country, there are still places where we struggle to keep the lights on. So we heard that loud and clear, that often in rural and remote areas, the technology is not reliable and it's expensive, so people prefer to borrow print resources because it's in their hands without relying on faulty technology. All right, so there is heaps more in the actual report, which I will leave you to read, but I just wanted to give you these teasers. What we're really seeing from all this is an Australian library community that is deeply committed to e-lending as a better way of serving their readers and building the reading community, but that there's real problems with the way the market is working at the moment. We see this demand-driven, forced demand-driven culture means there's a lot of unmet demand because collections budgets are going to certain material. And we see that it has clear implications for libraries' other important missions, like ensuring access to important cultural content and serving non-English speaking communities and those that are digitally excluded. Our final piece of work I just want to mention already commenced interviewing publishers about how and why they make the decisions that they do. This is the final bit of the puzzle before we commence our last task, which is making the legal and policy and practice reform recommendations on the basis of all of this evidence. And there are some really quite astonishing discoveries already coming out of this, and I can't resist telling you about just one of them. One of them is that, I told you publishers are a bit scared because Amazon's whispering in their ears about e-lending being bad for their readers. What we've discovered, and what comes as news to libraries as well, is that the publishers can't actually get any data on how often these books are being lent. So in their minds, they might think that it's thousands and thousands of times, and this is hugely interfering with their primary markets for sale. But in fact, we've developed a checkouts database, and we've looked at this, and the median number of times any ebook is actually lent out is 13. Right? So that's a really important piece of information, and it suggests that when we bring all of this together and we have a round table between publishers and libraries, we can actually perhaps implement some reforms to practice that don't even require legislative intervention and give both publishers and libraries more of what they want. All right, I've gone as quickly as I can because I know we're over time, but I'm going to consider this report launched. Please do read it and share it and talk about it and tweet about it and have a think about what it means for the future of lending in libraries. Thanks.
And even though it would be so interesting, we're not going to do questions because we are almost out of time, and you do have all the data and the whole full report up on there to look. So we will have our last speaker today, which is the good news story. I promised you that this was about opportunities and not just barriers. And this is where Ross comes in. Ross Balhari from the State Library of New South Wales. I will admit I have not prepared speaking about you. Ross is he's the service delivery coordinator for newsouthwales.net from the State Library of New South Wales, and essentially he manages the consortium for opt-in offer scheme for digital resources and a statewide licensed database called Indy Reads, and that's what we wanted to tell you about because this is a good news story about licensing of ebooks for libraries. Do come and let us know. I'll get you to, we'll have to finish up about 10 to 20 minutes.
Okay, no problem at all. Thank you, Jessica. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so as Jessica indicated, what I'll be talking about today is a local e-content management platform, which we refer to as Indy Reads. This platform is currently being rolled out to the New South Wales Public Library network. The platform obviously can host e-books, but it can also host audio and video content. What distinguishes Indy Reads from other platforms in use by public libraries across Australia is the collection that we've developed, the platform's enhanced functionality, which allows libraries to upload content and apply DRM where appropriate, and the bespoke license agreement that we've developed for this particular project. The platform was piloted in 2017 at Leichhardt and Parramatta Libraries in Sydney, and at the time we were interested to see if it was possible for the State Library to provide the public library network with the technical infrastructure and legal framework which would allow libraries to be local aggregators of content. Now, as you will hear, the project was partly a reaction to the turbulent e-lending licensing environment of the previous decade, but that continues to roll on to the present day. It was also an exploration of new publishing streams. It became apparent that beyond the big five publishers, there was also an exciting independent publishing scene, The self-publishing sector was also flourishing, challenging stereotypes associated with this particular publishing pathway. Based on the success of the pilot, we decided to proceed with the state rollout of the Indy Reads platform. The platform contains an opening collection of Australian independent published works, but also independent published works from overseas, the best examples of self-published content, as well as offering content in languages other than English. We've actually put together a sizable fund to purchase material in languages other than English, and this year we'll be engaging with the language specialists within the New South Wales Public Library Network to start that process of selecting content for the platform. So that's an exciting initiative. Libraries will also be encouraged to upload digitised material from their local studies collections, such as journals, manuscripts, and oral histories. The genesis of Indy Reads ties in with a narrative from Rebecca about the wider copyright environment in which libraries operate both domestically and internationally. The emergence of ebooks and the manner in which they are licensed by publishers for use in libraries has created many issues for the library profession around collection development, management, and community access to cultural works. These issues started impacting libraries back in 2010 when the popularity of ebooks in the general public skyrocketed. At the time, the Big Five publishers were grappling with the concept of e-lending in public libraries. Some declined not to make content available, whilst others explored a variety of access models, ranging from perpetual access, one copy, one loan, through to the exploding licenses that Rebecca referred to. One US library service had a really interesting response to the dilemma of ebook availability. The manager of Douglas County Libraries, Jamie LaRue, frustrated by the stance of the Big Five publishers, decided to look for alternative sources of content. And he discovered that there'd actually been a seismic shift in the publishing landscape. Advances in technology had democratised the means of publishing and distribution. Independent publishers and self-publishing were thriving, and unlike the Big Five, the independent publishers and self-publishing sectors were happy to sell content to Douglas County Libraries using their bespoke agreement. The Douglas County Library Initiative was a dynamic response to the issue of large publishers' reluctance to sell content, make it available for e-lending in libraries. The DCL model allowed libraries to become local aggregators of digital content and to introduce to their community a greater diversity of work, some of which was sourced from local publishers and authors. The US project inspired the State Library of New South Wales, along with a number of other libraries in Northern America, to explore the concept of library as an aggregator and the opportunities to introduce new streams of content from non-traditional sources to library members. To determine what content licensing opportunities existed for Australian public libraries, we need to take a closer look at the publishing landscape. What we know is that the publishing industry has obviously undertaken been radically changed by technology over the past 2 decades. Traditional legacy publishers are no longer the gatekeepers for publishing and distribution. Nowadays, a small independent publisher or a self-published author can easily publish and distribute works globally in both print and digital formats. Unfortunately, the publishing sector or industry sales data from sources such as PubStat and Nielsen BookScan do not capture the digital sales for self-published titles via the numerous online platforms and miss many of the smaller publishers. And as such, we are in the dark with regards to the exact figure for ebook sales. The data that we do have suggests that ebooks have been tracking at around 20% of the total book sales for a number of years. However, this reflects legacy publishing sector data. It has been speculated by a data analyst that the majority of annual ebook sales in the US are actually not recorded. Whilst the exact figures of unrecorded ebook sales is contentious, it is likely that non-legacy publisher annual sales eclipse the digital sales of traditional publishers. We know that 32% of titles on Amazon's bestseller list are actually self-published. It's also interesting to look at online reading platforms such as Wattpad, which offer a combination of free and paywall access to content. Wattpad has a staggering 80 million users internationally, and those users spend 22 billion minutes per month reading the content on that platform. I think it would be fascinating to know if the Wattpad community actually also engages with public libraries. Are they finding the content of interest to them in our collections? Domestically, there's also some interesting trends occurring. Research undertaken by Macquarie University and Melbourne University indicates that Australian genre fiction is shifting from traditional publishers to independent publishers and self-publishing. Academic Emmett Stinson noted that the publishing of Australian literary fiction and poetry has moved from large traditional publishers to small independent Australian publishers. The fact that the small press books dominated the shortlist of the most recent Man Booker Prize would also suggest that this is a similar trend occurring overseas. The dilemma for public libraries is it appears that the combined factors of ebook aggregator platforms, metered access licensing and the higher cost of ebooks when compared to the equivalent title in print has had an overall negative impact on the diversity of content in digital collections of public libraries. Due to the associated cost of delivering and maintaining a predominantly metered access collection, public libraries can only generate a reasonable return on investment from a monetary perspective by selecting the best sellers. And this was conclusion was alluded to by Rebecca. The cultural cost for our communities is that public library collections will reflect a narrower range of content than what is available in the print collections. Popular bestsellers will be purchased to the detriment of emerging authors and independent published titles, whilst best-selling content from the self-publishing ecosystem will also be missed due to issues around availability, but also the awareness of this content and the value of the content by the library profession. I think it's fair to say that if libraries do not explore the opportunities available to provide our communities with the best examples of independent and self-published content, we risk diluting our relevance to an unknown segment of our communities which have embraced this content. One of the challenges that we face going forward with this project is to dispel the perception amongst the library profession that self-published content is vanity press and represents universally poor quality content. There are numerous examples of self-published content being picked up by traditional publishers due to the established success of the author. There are also many authors which are happy to stay within the self-publishing ecosystem due to the success that they're having. These authors may not be known to bookshops or libraries, but they have sales which far exceed those of many authors which are actually household names. Beyond fiction work, there are also those who would like to document their community's history or their family history. They have interesting stories to tell. Kirsten alluded to Brad Stedman, an Indigenous elder from Brewarrina. I think Kirsten actually mentioned our project while she was out in that community, and Brad actually reached out to me some time ago, and he's interested in writing a work about or documenting the history of his local rugby club. So there's a really interesting opportunity for public libraries to help support community writers to publish their work and to distribute their work. Another benefit of licensing content from independent publishers and self-published authors relates to the issue of diversity. A study in the US demonstrated that traditional publishers have a dismal record for publishing titles that could be considered diverse in content. Over a 20-year period, the study concluded that the percentage of diverse content had not moved from 10%, even though there had been a radical shift in the demographics across the United States over that period. Whereas the anecdotal evidence suggests that small press and independent press and self-published authors have an output that is far more representative of the experiences of the wider community. As our communities change, public libraries need to ensure that we provide collections which mirror the diversity of experiences of our patrons. Otherwise, we risk alienating that segment of our community. Indy Reads can help address this issue through the proactive licensing by the State Library. Public libraries using our bespoke agreement will also be able to license and upload content directly from community publishers. Several New South Wales public libraries situated in the ethnically diverse western suburbs of Sydney have already formed partnerships with literary movements such as Sweatshop and Westwards, which aim to empower marginalised communities take control of how they are being portrayed and perceived, and to build alternatives through artistic endeavours such as writing. Having identified the opportunity to bring new content streams to the New South Wales public libraries, the next consideration was around the manner in which we could purchase the content. Initially, we had hoped to use a similar approach to Douglas County Libraries. They had developed a simple 2-page statement of common understanding which articulated the terms of acquisition in plain English. After seeking domestic legal advice, I was advised that a simple contract would be a better approach to it in Australia due to the differences between Australian and US copyright law. So several months later, the 2-page statement of common understanding became the 10-page contract called New South Wales Public Library Agreement for Purchasing Electronic Content. The State Library has successfully used this agreement to purchase content from Australian publishers. The agreement, as indicated, will be made available to the New South Wales Public Library Network. The licence agreement is based on the principles of perpetual access and preservation, includes the right to move the content to an alternative platform if we so decide at a later date, a default 1 copy, 1 loan lending model, but with the flexibility to negotiate alternative forms of concurrent access, the right to modify files for accessibility purposes, and it also contains the flexibility to accommodate consortia and standalone acquisitions. During the pilot phase, we reached out to a small sample of independent Australian publishers to gauge their interest in selling content directly to the State Library. We discovered a great deal of enthusiasm for the initiative. A number of these publishers had never sold digital content to public libraries before. Using the agreement, we negotiated for the acquisition of over 1,000 titles. At present, we're working with around 20 Australian publishers, and as the project continues, we will reach out and license content from new publishers. Beyond the pilot, we identified an opportunity to create a statewide collection of titles which complemented existing public library collections by focusing on mid-list and small independent Australian and international publishers. We also wanted to ensure that the New South Wales community had ongoing access to important works in digital formats such as international classics and modern literary titles, plus award winners from across a diverse range of genre categories. We were fortunate at the time to be in a position where we could purchase a large collection of new edition classics from one of the big 5 publishers before they transitioned from a perpetual access license model to a metered access license. The titles, which cost around $20 on average for a perpetual access license, jumped overnight to $60 for a 2-year metered access license. With regards to self-published content, the challenge facing libraries is how do we identify the best examples? To solve this issue, the State Library of New South Wales used the bestseller list supplied by one of the main self-publishing aggregators, Smashwords. The titles were then manually benchmarked against Goodreads, which is an online social reading platform, with selections based on a combination of the number of written reviews and star ratings. We hope to eventually automate this process via an API. Okay, we've also been in conversation with our colleagues in the United States, where public library engagement with self-published authors has been underway for a number of years with initiatives such as Self-E, Indy's Author Day, and the soon-to-be famous Illinois Author Project. There are many examples of library-sponsored writing competitions in the US and networking days which bring together community authors and editors and local publishers. They also run writing workshops for aspiring authors within their community. They even have a National Library Award for the Best Emerging Writer in particular genre categories. One short-term aim is to buy a collection of content which is being curated by the Library Journal, and they're behind the Indie Authors Day project. The collection contains 400 self-published titles which are available under an unlimited simultaneous access license. I've been informed that one library service in the US, which has this collection, has recorded 30,000 loans for a 1-month period. So there's certainly an appetite for self-published content. To conclude, we are midway through phase 1 of the project. So we have approximately 50% of public libraries where we've configured the library management system with the Indy Reads platform, and that then facilitates the ability for a library patron to download the content onto their platform, onto their device. Phase 2 will be focused on local studies material, and those libraries which are interested in uploading their digitised collections or part of their collections onto the platform. So we'll be providing the necessary training to facilitate that. And phase 3, which is probably 14 or 15 months away, we'll be looking at library engagement with their community in regards to assisting aspiring authors and also licensing content from local publishers and authors. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ross. Again, we've run out of time for questions, but I love the story of Indy Reads as a benefit for authors, for underserved authors and for libraries. It's, as I said, it's a good news story coming out of what is often seen as a problem for people. So I hope that at some point we can maybe even move it beyond New South Wales, start looking at others. I want to have access to it. I see it as the Triple J of Australian books. That's how I think it should be. And I can see it being really influential. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Sorry that we ran so late. We haven't done this for a few years. I think it's the afternoon tea. I'll have to take it out again. But it's really great to have you all here, and for those who stuck out, one more year. I hope that today has given you some real thought about a new perspective on some of the issues that you deal with day to day. That's what today was about, thinking of the different angles that you might need to come at things from to try to solve them, and the different possibilities that you have. We will be doing it again all again next year, and in the meantime I'd just like to say thank you very much. For anybody who's around this evening, there's bound to be a few of us going out to drinks. I know I'm planning on it. And